Good morning. Good morning, good people. We want to look at perceptual learning. And perceptual learning, coming from the portions of perception we were discussing, which emanates from bottom-up perception and top-down perception, where the bottom-up perception rallies behind the external information that we get from outside, and then comes to perceptual top-down processing, which the perception which is influenced by insight, internal, where there's the constructivist approach using of the thought principles, where one has to use much of high cognitive rationing more than before. So perceptual learning wants to look at what perceptual learning is and also trying to differentiate it from other aspects of short-term. Post-perceptual learning is regarded as perceptual learning through long-lasting effects. Not learning, not perceiving, and not learning based on perception. Okay, so perceptual learning is defined as roughly a long-lasting changes in perception that result from practice or experience. That's where that ecological theory by Gibson that we discussed first in bottom-up comes into play. So William James gave an example of a wine tester. How can a wine tester differentiate the taste of wine from the upper half of the bottle against from the lower half of the bottle? Yes. So that one is not learning based on perception, but it's perceptual learning. It happened over time till the person starts to understand the taste of wines of the upper bottle and the lower bottle. Yes. So long lasting. So in this lesson, it want to discuss about three portions which are here. That perception learning is defined as long-term changes, and then the other part talks about contrast classes, other things that may also what do you call it, perceptual learning versus some things which also look like perceptual learning, but it's only limited for that purpose, like perceptual-based skills and other only. Then the second part is trying to differentiate varieties of perceptual learning as well. And then the third part also try to come up with a philosophical literature. Why is it philosophically significant? That's why we always encourage reading, so that you always also researching more than just relying on notes and what do you call it, the study guide, so that you also get other information, other journals that people are also trying to give information towards such information, which is very important in our learning. So perceptual learning as a long-term changes. Since we have defined, let's come back to the definition. Perceptual learning is roughly a long-lasting changes in perception that result from practice or experience. Okay, so perceptual learning as a long-term changes. This criterion rules out some short-term changes in perception, like a sensory adaptation, where you come from a dark room going into a light, or coming from a light room going into darkness till you adjust, then you start to see. No, differentiate from that. So perceptual learning as the perception changes as well. So this perceptual learning, it involves changes in perception. So that's why they say what it's a long-term thing, isn't it? Yes, it's not just like limited on one thing, but it's what it's a long-term thing. Like for example, which is here, suppose a contrarian who likes things only so far as other people do not like those things. Suppose he finds out that everyone is come to like his favorite microbrew, this might cause him to change how he judges that beer aesthetically. However, the beer may well taste the same to him. So in that case of perceptual learning, but a mere change in the perception is aesthetic judgment. It's not perceptual learning, but a person just change the way what they judge things. Like here, perceptual learning, it involves changes in perception, while learning is based on perception need not. You see. Look at my table. I might learn that the cup is on the table. However, this does not involve long-term changes in perception. You see, but it is learning based on perception. So that's why it involves changes in perceiving. You see, while learning is based on perception, that's why they said need not. isn't it? Which means perceptual learning, it involves changes in perception. You see now, even though learning based on perception, but in perceptual learning, learning should not be based on perception. You see, but learning should influence perception. I believe you get this one right. That's why there is also perceptual skills or also this example. That you will learn that the cup, you might, okay, let me take you here. I might learn to put the cup on the table into the dishwasher every time it's empty. You see now. Yes. But doesn't mean that it changes your perception. But you just learn through perceiving that this cup is empty. But when it's empty, I can put it in the dishwasher every time when it's empty. You see. But it's not a long-term effect that influences the way you view certain things, but it's just based on the cup. Okay, that's what they said, what? It's learning based on perception. And also there's perceptual learning as a result from practice or experience. So perceptual learning involves perception changes of a particular kind, namely those that's a result from practice or experience. For this reason, let's say a laser eye surgery or a cataract removal do not count as instances of perceptual learning because they are going to influence if cataract is removed or any eye surgery. It either improves your visual or it diminishes your visual, but it doesn't change the way you perceive in terms of like compared to perceptual learning. Though to some extent it influences information you're taking, but it does not do not count for perceptual learning. So they are not really cases of learning, but a result of practice or experience. You see, there's an experience. So while such cases involve long-term changes in perception, they do not count as cases of perception learning. You see, so to be authentic case of learning, perceptual changes, you have to be result of learning process. You see, as a contrast case, suppose some undergoes a long-term change in his or her perception due to brain lesion. Such change in perception does not result from a learning process, since the change in perception comes from the lesion or the removal of that brain part, rather than practice or experience. So because of this, the case does not count as an instance of perceptual learning, even though it involves long-term changes in the way you perceive. So some other potential phases of defining perceptual learning. Let's go to Elenio Gibson, definition of perceptual learning. There are also other counts in the, let me come here. Perceptual learning, it involves relatively long-lasting changes to an organism's perceptual system that improve its ability to respond to its environment and are caused by this environment. Take note of the italics that are made for proper emphasis, you see, that are caused by this environment. And also this definition offers an answer to the question as to why perceptual learning occurs at all, you see. So Goldstone accounts two different interpretations. One interpretation, the account places a condition of perceptual learning that to account as an instance of perceptual learning. And long-term perceptual changes to improve an organism's ability to respond to the environment, you see now. Such an account, it gains plausible if one thinks of learning as a success term, you see. On second interpretation, Goldstone's account, however, it is not that each instance of perceptual learning is to improve an organism's ability to respond to the environment. Rather, it is that perceptual learning is a general capacity for improving an organism's ability to respond to the environment. It's more like a capacity, like increasing more of your capacity for you to adapt to the environment, even if perceptual learning fails to do so in some instances, you see. So contrast cases are some of the things that we may assume are perceptual learning, but they are not. For instance, like perceptual development, you'll find out in developmental psychology, maybe if you look at Piaget, that we're going to look at perceptual learning. I believe in human development, it also talks about perceptual development, some point in time on motor development. Then experiment, which usually comes into play, like for the one that we put a bottom up, where a baby, if you go back to your slides of bottom-up processing, where there was a baby and then red square boxes like a scotch like on a glass. So with perceptual development, like kids, as they grow, end up understanding depth perception, time perception, motion perception, size constant, and so on. So they're saying such things, that's why they're called contrast classes, because they influence your perception with time. You see, so that's why you find out perceptual development is there, because it's different from perceptual learning. But that is the development of what? Of your body. So specifically, they think that data on infant perception, okay, let me take you to this in short here. In short, according to Kelman and Garrigan, evidence on infant perception, including evidence about object perception, perception of faces, perception of three-dimensional space, tells against the view that all perceptual development is learned. You see, but some instances they call it maturation. You see now. So that's why the debate of empiricism and nativism comes into play now. You see, where the nativist, they will say the environment helps the person to grow. I mean, sorry, the nativist, they will say the internal structures which influence a person to grow makes the person trust to understand the environment as they mature. As well as the empiricist, they say the environment. You see, since we learn, we will perceive to learn or learn to perceive so that, we adapt. And we always say the environment influences the way you perceive and also influences your perceptual growth. So now this part, maturation, comes into play, isn't it? Yes, but though perceptual development, it involves perceptual learning, isn't it? However, it does not just involve perceptual learning, but maturation comes into play. That's why it overrides perceptual learning. Because in this sense, is much of it, it's maturation. So there are many ways where they can try to make a distinction between perceptual maturation and perceptual learning. Some of those debates, like what I've said, of the nativism and empiricism, where they try to differentiate between innate and acquired characteristics. So one potential criterion here is that cases of perceptual maturation involves perceptual abilities that are typical of species, while cases of learning involves perceptual abilities that are not typical of the species. You see, so maturation is more like of the things that you are supposed to see, isn't it? Yes, like your ear is supposed to hear, isn't it? But now perceptual learning, where we always say reading between the lines, that's where perceptual learning comes into play, where you end up reading between the lines, where you go beyond your sensory abilities now, trying to understand the environment. That's why they put perceptual development and maturation, isn't it? So the criterion seems to get it right. For instances of perceptual learning, saying for those involved in bird watching, you see a bird, but in bird watching, since you understand birds through over time, it becomes more of what? An ability. Let's look at this one before we go further. After all, the perceptual abilities acquired in bird watching are unique to bird watchers, not typical of the entire human race. You see. However, this criterion seems to get it wrong for others and more universal instances perceptual learning. Human faces are both ubiquitous and important to humans. So it's more like they're important, isn't it? So the perceptual learning involves in face perception is in fact typical of the species, you see. So in the literature on perceptual learning, the distinction between learning and maturation has been drawn the line as the role of the environment, you see. Okay, so let's look at another one, perception-based skills. These ones are related to such as dart throwing, race car driving, playing pool, and so on. So to understand the relationship between perceptual learning and perception-based skills, let's consider Williams and David in Cross 2008. They report that when expert soccer players defend opponent, they focus longer on their opponent hips than non-experts do, you see. Non-experts, maybe we look at the ball, the professional players, they look at the hips. Hip movement, it directs the next outcome. So this turn attention is a long-term change in perception and results from practice or experience. It's more of tuned attention. You choose where to attend to. That's why they call it perception-based skills. Perceptual learning are skills for you to adapt, isn't it? That's why they put the bird watching as also another example, but it's different from dart throwing, race car driving, playing soccer, isn't it? Because you are attending to a certain specific area, you see. So that's why they call it what? Perception-based skill. You can look at this example, attending to the hips. For soccer players, you help them to defend well rather than looking at the ball or rather than looking at other things. Then comes to cognitive penetration. This one, it involves, what do you call it? Let's look at this perceptual learning. It involves changes in perception that are long-term. So cognitive penetration, the long-term criterion rules out some cases of cognitive penetration, where your beliefs, thoughts, or desires influences the way you perceive. For instance, if Jill sees Jack as angry because she just now believes Jack is angry, this need not be a case of perception learning, since it need not be a long-term change, isn't it? She will learn that Jack is angry, isn't it? Yes, and believe Jack is angry. But it's not a long term that Jack is always angry, Jack is angry, Jack is angry. But it's based on that uh, short term, you see. So cognitive penetration also are not cases of perceptual learning, but it does not follow that one cases of cognitive penetration as cases of perceptual learning. But uh, it's just that in your thoughts, desires, as well as maybe to some extent your knowledge also influences what? The way you perceive. Uh, Now looking at machine learning, machine learning is machine perception seeks to enable many machines to perceive their environments by sensory needs, as humans and animals do. So standard cases of machine perception involves computers that are able to recognize speech, faces, even barcodes. You see, so some types of machine perception are simply programmed into the device. For instance, some speech recognition devices are simply programmed to recognize speech and do not learn beyond what they have been programmed to do. If you find out this artificial intelligence nowadays, they're talking about robots. So all these stories of robots, it's coming from this part. You see, where they're trying to make the robots to do perceptual learning. You see, not do machine learning like you program them, but so that for them to learn beyond programming. Now that comes what? Perceptual learning, where they get information, process it, and then it comes up with a certain idea different from how they were programmed. And then going to contrast classes, I mean, variety of perceptual learning, there's differentiation where people reflect on perceptual learning. So the cases that tend to come in differentiation is a person comes to perceive the difference between two properties where they could not perceive this difference before. You see, William James' case of a person learning to distinguish between upper and lower half of a particular one bottle. You see now, that's differentiation, where you tend to discover that you were not seeing before, for them to adapt because they are wine testers, isn't it? Yes. You can see the other explanations which are here. However, through practice, one becomes able to distinguish between upper and lower. So this paradigm case of differentiation, psychologists have studied differentiation in lab environments and so on, so that they come up with this example and also see how it influences or see how it becomes part of what? Perceptual learning. Then it comes to unitization, is the counterpart to differentiation. Unitization, person comes to perceive as a single property, what they previously perceived as two distinct properties. Written words, isn't it? We perceive written word in English, we do not simply perceive two or more distinct letters. At first, A, E, I, O, U. And secondly, clan is a letter. The first CLAN, then the second, you now know that these are combination of letters, how to combine those letters, isn't it? Yes, so we learn unitization. It also what? Varieties of perceptual learning, you see. And then from there, there's attentional weighing. Through practice or experience, people come to systematically attend towards certain objects and properties away from other objects and properties. You see, attentional weighing, let's say shown in sports studies where it has been found, for instance, the expert fencers attend more to their opponent's upper track area, while non-experts attend more to what? To their opponent's upper area, upper leg area, you see. Like that example of the soccer player, there's a little bit of attention weighing. It also comes into play. And then in the case of expert fencer, a shift in the weight of attention to the upper trunk facilitates the expert fencing skills. You see, perception-based skills, and then attention weighing. Then it comes to expert fencing skills, perception-based skills of soccer, and then attention weighing becomes to expert soccer skills or football skills. You see. So then comes to stimulus imprinting. This one I will give you as an activity. So activity, go beyond these notes. What is a case of stimulus imprinting? This one is similar to unitization, but it's different. So this one will take it to our discussion forum where people will comment about what stimulus imprinting. And then looking again at the contents of perception, let's say the philosophical significance, the other portion of perceptual learning, where philosophical significance of perceptual learning comes into play as well. So this philosophical significance comes into theoretical perspective, where Gibson and Piaget were giving a certain explanation that they were giving towards what perceptual learning. So philosophical significance of perceptual learning, uh, let me take you here. However, there are good reasons to see perceptual learning as philosophically significant in terms of like how significant it is philosophical learning and how also significant it is to study philosophical learning. I mean, sorry, perceptual learning as well. So one reason is that it says something about the very nature of perception, that perception is more complex than it might seem from the first person point of view. You see, specifically the fact that perceptual learning occurs mean that the causes of perceptual states are not just the objects in our immediate environment, as it seems as first glance. So which means we also play a role. So the content of perception also influences. Let us go to the dynamic systems. How do we learn to perceive? And then the Gibsonian theory, the ecological approach. So Piaget used dynamical systems theory that we have continued along similar lines and tackled the question, however, we learn to perceive. So Piaget talks about sensory motor approach, proposed that perception is constituted by the possession and depending on the interpretation, also the enactment, possession of skillful master of sensory motor regularities. So that in order to perceive something as soft, one must already know how, where one should apply pressure to it. You see. So the question that emerges is how we ever learn to perceive something new if according to this approach, perception requires already having sort of sensory mastery. You see, so also Piaget was talking more of sensory development as well, which is also very important in perception, where you have to manipulate your sensory organs for you to get enough information. So in this way, that we know how to perceive is perceivable, but that in which we don't know how to perceive could not be perceived because why would we develop new forms of mastery in order to perceive something we don't even know is true or is there, sorry, you see. So that's why they were mentioning about perceptual learning, like we see the necessity of it, and then by seeing the necessity of it, you see, now then you end up learning how to master it since you have seen it's there, not because you assume, but you have to see it's there or you have to experience it, isn't it? Not something that you don't know. Now, the Gibsonian theory or an ecological approach, uh, this Gibson changed the field of perception and developed the research by emphasizing the importance of environment and context in learning. So perception is important because it allows us to adapt to our environment. So that Gibson asked the important question about often missing in developmental research. How do we learn to perceive our world? Children learn to detect information that species, objects, events, and layers in the world that they can cause or use for their daily activities. You see, so that's humans learn out of necessity. You see, so children are information hunter-gatherers. You see, we learn out of necessity. So according to Gibson definition of perception, he says our means of keeping in touch with the world, of obtaining information about the world and when we are in it. You see, there is a reciprocity of the perceiver and the environment. So the perceiver and the environment function in a circle that can begin by the environment providing information on, or an opportunity what they call affordance for an action by the perceiver, investigating for yourself. So the environment can be both physical and social. Baby is poked by a sharp object, you see. Baby explores the crib or the house, you see, to find a soft space where to do, you see. Coming here, baby is poked by a sharp object, so the baby cries. Caregiver comes to comfort. Social environment, the sharp object, physical environment, perceiver action, the baby cries. Affordance. What the environment offers or provides for an organism opportunities for action. So Gibson believes affordance are perceived directly. He says that instead of perceiving stimuli images or a sensation, we actually perceive things we can eat, sit on, talk to, or walk on, you see. So experience creates new affordances, you see. So affordance, what the environment offers and provides for organisms and opportunities for an action, not what is not there. As children develop new motor skills, they discover new affordances. They discover what the environment can also offer them. When they're growing, they discover they got hands, you see how they do. There's a fit between the environment provides and the child's actions and goals, you see. Then there's an example here. Gibson performed an experiment with babies that could crawl, babies that could walk. Infants were placed on a walkway 4 feet from the floor. If you still remember that top down, that bottom up slide, that first image where the baby is crawling and then there's this red thing. That is the experiment was conducted by Gibson, who is here. So their mother smiling stood at the other end of the walkway, you see. So the rigid surface, so the first portion is the rigid surface, plywood covered with fabric that afforded the babies to walk or crawl. The second walkaway was a patterned fabric on a waterbed, which afforded crawling but not walking. So the babies could walk, spend more time investigating the waterbed surface and the rigid surface before they decided to walk or crawl. So meanwhile, crawling babies did not differentiate between the two surfaces, crawling on both readily. So how do we perceive? Gibson believed that affordance are perceived directly, and thus complex information is inherent in stimulation. You see, for example, learning the difference between a dog and a cat is or a bit harder. Learning the difference between two similar looking cats becomes harder. You see, and then these portions I'm leaving to you as exercises, assumptions, and then implication of the theory. You see, assumptions, children are hunter-gatherers. Then the implication of the theory is Gibson's experiments paid a lot of attention to affordance or opportunities the environment provides. Learning is self-directed, you see. So that is the assumption. And then the assumption, which is on the theory, how the theory explains the assumption. Another one, humans have evolved adaptive ways of perceiving the world. The implication of the theory, the information extracted from the world perceived is species specific. So we'll give you this as an activity as well about finding more assumptions and then implication of the theory, trying to see how it can be applied to the real world where you're living in. So you can also look at more other perceptual development theories as well as perceptual learning theories. You have a wonderful day. So the question, what is there to perceive? Reference, you can see it. You have a great time.